His face is pressed into the snow. The temperature is 40 degrees below zero. The wind is screaming at 70 miles per hour. And Beck Weathers hasn't moved in over 12 hours. His hands frozen solid. His face a black mask of dead, frost-bitten skin. His body curled up on the South Col of Mount Everest, the most exposed, brutally cold place on the surface of this planet. 2 separate rescue teams have already found him, checked him, and walked away. Because, as far as anyone on that mountain could tell, Beck Weathers was already dead. Except he wasn't. Before we get into what happened next, you need to know who this guy was. Beck Weathers was not a professional climber. He was a 49-year-old pathologist from Dallas, Texas, a doctor, a husband, a father of 2 kids. But Beck had a secret that most people around him didn't fully understand. For most of his adult life, he had battled serious, crushing depression, the kind that made getting out of bed feel like climbing a mountain, metaphorically speaking. And somewhere along the way, he discovered that actually climbing mountains, real ones, was the only thing that cut through that darkness, the only thing that made him feel truly alive. So he climbed, he got good at it, and in 1996, he joined one of the most experienced commercial expeditions ever assembled on Everest, led by a legendary New Zealand guide named Rob Hall. Now here's what you need to understand about Everest in 1996. Commercial climbing on the mountain was still relatively new. Rich, ambitious people were paying big money to be guided to the top of the world, and Rob Hall's operation, Adventure Consultants, was the best in the business. But there was something else you need to know. Above 26,000 feet on Everest, there's a zone climbers called the Death Zone, and that name is not dramatic. It's accurate. Up there, the air has so little oxygen that your body is literally breaking down faster than it can repair itself. Every minute you spend above that line, you are losing brain cells, muscle tissue, and decision-making ability. You are dying, slowly, the entire time you're up there. On the morning of May 10, 1996, Beck and the rest of the group pushed for the summit. But almost immediately, Beck ran into a problem. He'd had a type of eye surgery years earlier called radial keratotomy, and in the extreme cold and low oxygen, his corneas swelled. His vision started going. In the dark, at altitude, he was going partially blind. Rob Hall made a call. Beck would wait at a spot called the balcony, a flat section on the southeast ridge at around 27,600 feet, while the group went ahead to the summit. If Beck's vision came back when the sun came up, he could continue. If not, he'd head back down. Beck agreed. He sat down in the snow, and he waited. He waited for over 4 hours. And while Beck sat there on that ledge, alone at 27,600 feet, something was building on the horizon that nobody on that mountain had seen coming. A storm. A massive, fast-moving, catastrophic storm. By early afternoon, it hit, and when it hit, it didn't ease in. It arrived like a wall. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The wind went from manageable to hurricane force in what felt like minutes. The temperature, already brutal, dropped even further. Beck joined a group of climbers trying to navigate back down to Camp 4, which is also called High Camp. It's located on the South Col, a flat, barren, wind-blasted saddle between Everest and the neighboring peak Lhotse. The guide with the group was Mike Groom, an experienced Aussie climber, but even he was struggling. Here's the problem with the South Col in a whiteout. There are no landmarks. No trees, no rock formations you can use to orient yourself. It's just flat, gray, frozen nothing in every direction. And when you're exhausted, oxygen deprived, and can barely see your own hand in front of your face, you walk in circles. and that's exactly what they did. One of the climbers in the group, a Japanese woman named Yasuko Namba, collapsed. She couldn't go any further. Beck himself was barely upright. His core temperature was dropping. His hands, exposed to the wind for hours, were starting to freeze. Not just cold, freeze. The tissue hardening, the blood pulling away from the surface, the cells beginning to die. Then another guide, Stuart Hutchinson, reached them, and he had to make one of the most brutal calls in the history of mountaineering. He looked at Beck, he looked at Yasuko, and he determined that they were too far gone. Moving them, trying to carry them back through the storm would kill the rescuers. The math was terrible, but it was clear. They left them there, in the snow, still alive, but left. Beck couldn't move. He couldn't speak loud enough to be heard over the wind. He felt the cold stop hurting, and if you know anything about frostbite, you know that when it stops hurting, that is the worst possible sign. Pain means the nerves are still working. Silence means they're gone. He lost consciousness. Hours passed. The storm kept howling. Nobody came. When the sun came up the next morning, a second rescue team swept the col looking for survivors. They found Beck. They rolled him over. His face was black, frostbitten so deeply the skin had already begun to die. His hands were curled up like claws, frozen solid. One arm was raised stiffly toward the sky like he'd been reaching for something. They checked for a pulse. It was there, barely, a faint flutter, but his condition was so severe, his survival so improbable, that the team made the same call as the night before. They left. And the word went out across the mountain, and then out of the mountain, and across the radio, and eventually into a phone call that reached a house in Dallas, Texas, where Beck's wife, Peach, was told that her husband was dead. But Beck wasn't dead. He was somewhere in between, in that gray space between alive and gone, where the brain is still firing, but the body has basically given up. And then something happened that Beck himself has never been able to fully explain. He saw his family. Not a dream, not a hallucination, or at least not the way we normally use that word. He described it later as the most vivid, real experience of his life. He saw his wife, Peach. He saw his daughter, Meg, and his son, Beck Jr. They were clear. They were there. And somewhere in the back of his dying brain, a signal fired. Get up! Beck opened his eyes. The wind was still going. The cold was still there. His hands, he couldn't feel them at all. His face felt like it belonged to someone else. His right arm was still raised toward the sky, frozen in place. He didn't know how long he'd been lying there. He didn't know what time it was. He knew one thing. If he stayed where he was going to die. That was certain. So the only play, the only option, was to move. He got up. Just that, just standing up. That was the first small target. He couldn't grip anything with his hands. They were frozen blocks, so he used his wrists. He couldn't see well. His vision was still bad, the light blinding against the snow. He couldn't feel his feet inside his boots, but he could stand, and then he could take one step. So he did. He fell almost immediately, got back up, fell again, got back up again. He walked nearly a mile across the South Col in hurricane-force wind, essentially blind, with no feeling from his elbows down, no feeling in his feet, guided by nothing except a faint, distant glow he could see through the blur of ice and snow, the tents at Camp 4. One step, fall, get up, one more step. That was it. That was his whole strategy. That was the only plan he had. When Beck Weathers pushed through the door of that tent at Camp 4, the climbers inside thought they were looking at a ghost. Because as far as everyone on that mountain knew, Beck was dead. He'd been left twice. He'd been out in that storm for close to 20 hours. His face looked like something out of a horror movie, black, swollen, barely recognizable as human skin. But he was standing there, breathing. They got him into a sleeping bag. They poured warm fluids into him. They did everything they could, and somehow, through that night, Beck held on. The next morning, the decision was made to attempt something that had almost never been done at that altitude, a helicopter rescue from Camp 2, sitting at 21,000 feet. At that height, the air is so thin that helicopters can barely generate enough lift to fly. Most pilots won't even attempt it. A Nepalese pilot named Madan KC attempted it anyway. He made 2 separate flights into that mountain. He pulled Beck Weathers and another critically injured climber off of Everest. It is still considered one of the most daring high-altitude rescues in the history of mountaineering. Beck was airlifted to a hospital in Kathmandu, then flown back to Texas. The doctors who treated him said they had never seen a patient survive that level of frostbite exposure. Never. Beck Weathers lost a lot. His right hand was amputated. All the fingers on his left hand gone. His nose was so badly damaged it had to be surgically reconstructed using tissue from his ear and forehead. Parts of both feet gone. He went back to work as a pathologist with one hand. He learned to function in a world that looked nothing like the one he'd left. He and Peach, their marriage had been strained for years, and the mountain almost finished it. But they worked at it. They stayed together. In 2000, Beck wrote a book about everything: the climb, the storm, the marriage, the depression, all of it. He called it Left for Dead. It's worth reading. But here's what I want to leave you with, and this is the part that sticks with me every time I come back to this story. Beck Weathers was not the strongest climber on that mountain that day. He was not the most experienced. He was not the youngest or the fittest. There were professional guides, people who had summited Everest multiple times, who did not make it off that mountain alive. Beck made it because of one thing. When his brain gave him a reason, when that image of his wife and kids cut through the cold and the dark and the dying, he acted on it, immediately. He didn't wait to feel better. He didn't wait for the wind to stop. He got up on dead feet, with frozen hands, and he pointed himself at a faint light in the distance. That's it. That's the whole lesson. In a survival situation, and honestly, in life, your why is what keeps you moving when every single part of your body is screaming at you to stop. You don't need to see the whole path, you just need the next small target. Find it, move toward it, and then find the next one. Beck Weathers did that on the most dangerous mountain on Earth with half his body frozen solid. What's your excuse? If Beck Weathers can walk a mile across Everest on frozen feet, you can hit that subscribe button right now. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.